We're in a series here at Hope that this summer that we're calling The Way To, and we're looking at specific locations in the New Testament where God interfaced with his people in special ways. And today we're looking at a geographical area that you've probably heard of, Galilee. What's so special about Galilee? Lots of things. Jesus is raised in Galilee. Jesus is baptized in Galilee. Jesus walks on water in Galilee. Jesus calms the storm in Galilee. Jesus delivers a sermon on the Mount in Galilee. Jesus feeds the 5,000 in Galilee. Very cool, right? We are not going to talk about any of those things today. Because this is Father's Day, we're going to talk about a Galilean father, his son, and Jesus. This particular story is recorded in all the synoptic gospels. We're going to look particularly beginning this sermon in Mark 9. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied. "How long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So when they brought him, when the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground, rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus. "Everything is possible for one who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you to come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. Well, what is happening here in Galilee? Well, first of all, we have a concerned father. I wish I knew more about this man. We don't know if he was wealthy or poor, educated or self-taught. But I'd imagine this to be true. There is nothing that you or I could teach him about brokenness. He had earned his PhD in pain. This dad was on call 24 hours a day. Now, some of you may identify with this father. It may not be a paralyzing pain that all can see. It may be a heaviness that comes and goes, but it's a brokenness that you can't throw money at, or a vacation, or a new house to make it better. Years ago, an article appeared in People magazine about Eddie Murphy, and you'd think this Hollywood star would be feeling no pain, and yet here's what he says. He said, "I feel a void. There's not a total emptiness, but I feel something's missing. No matter how much you accomplish, how much money you make, how many cars or houses you have, or how many people you make happy, life isn't perfect for anybody." Life was certainly difficult for the father in our story, and yet his faith produced hope. What else do we have in this story? Well, we have a troubled son. And this is a bit of a complicated matter, because what's up with this boy? Now, we looked at the Mark version, and we'll look at it again, but here's what it says in Matthew 17. "Lord, have mercy on my son," he said. "He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water." Now, as we just read in Mark 9:17, "Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid." Okay, so is this a seizure or is it a spirit? Now, I looked at 32 translations of the Matthew account, and 11 translations call the young man's challenge epilepsy. 11 other translations said seizures. Now, the King James Version says, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is a lunatic. Now, that's pretty severe. But in that time period, there was a madness thought to be caused by the moon, Luna. So there's that. 10 translations said that. Those 32 translations were in the Matthew account. Now, here's where the complications comes in. In the Mark account that we read earlier, all 32 say he's possessed by a spirit, a demon, if you will. When Jesus gets in the middle of it, it becomes obvious that it is a spirit. But I love what the Father ultimately says. And all translations agree on this part. Here is simply what he says. He says, my son suffers terribly, and he often falls into the fire or the water. He is not prepared to split theological or medical hairs. He said, my boy is in trouble. Okay, so what can we take with us from the Father today on this Father's Day? Well, I think we can learn at least 4 things. Here are 4 lessons from the Father this Father's Day. The first is this, and they apply to all of us, not just to fathers. When your world is crashing in on you, don't be afraid to ask God for help. Now, you know, that may seem obvious, especially to a crowd here and a crowd online that has come to worship. But sometimes we are in a crisis. We forget the obvious, especially if we're new to this God thing, as some of us are in this room. We hunker down and we do what we've always done in crisis. If it is your tendency to run in crisis, you run. If your tendency is to drink in crisis, you drink. Years ago, I received a very desperate call from a guy at the end of his rope. His problems had totally overwhelmed him. And he lived in another state and asked if he could fly to Memphis and spend a couple hours with me. I picked him up at the airport. We settled down in a little grill downtown Memphis, and we talked for 3 hours. His faith in God was minuscule, and yet he was trying with all that he had to bring God into his crisis equation. Now, the Father in our text is no great man of faith either. He is no profound theologian. But just like my friend who flew in to see me, I am so taken by the Father's honesty and his vulnerability. Because in verse 22, he pleads with Jesus. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. I mean, he said, if you can? I mean, don't you mean since you can? No. He means if. He's much more meek than mighty. And even Jesus challenges his phrasing, if you'll recall. Verse 23, Jesus says, if you can. He says, everything is possible for him who believes. And immediately the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. Isn't that great? I mean, don't you love that response? I'm making that Hope's verse of the year. I mean, oh, that we were all this honest with God. God, I believe you to a point. Now please walk with me to the next point. Years ago, and some of you may recall this, we had a power outage in Memphis in the summer. And it knocked out the power at our house for 12 days in a Memphis summer. It was miserable. And in the darkness of our home during the power outage, one would have to walk with care because, see, the candle in the next room could not light the room in which you stood, but you could see the faint light down the hallway. And if you moved very carefully toward the light, soon all was made plain. We might not have all the answers, but if we move toward the light that is Christ, our dark world will begin to take shape. The psalmist writes this beautiful psalm in Psalm 91. Because he loves me, says the Lord, I will rescue him. I will protect him, for he acknowledges my name. He will call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him, and I will honor him. So what's the first thing we can learn from the Father today? When your world is crashing in on you, don't be afraid to ask God for help. What else can the Father teach us? Here's the second thing. In prayer, don't worry so much about your words. God listens to your heart. Do you ever get nervous about having to pray in public? You know, you just kind of can't do it. You're out to lunch with some folks, or you're over at some family member's house for Thanksgiving, and somebody looks around the room and looks at you and says, hey, you're the closest thing to a Christian in this room. Would you pray? And you don't know if you're going to say the right thing. Here's something we all need to remember. The power is not in the one who prays. The power is not in the prayer. It is in the one who hears it. And Jesus makes an interesting comment at the end of this passage. His disciples had pulled him aside after the miracle and asked, why couldn't we drive this evil spirit out? And Jesus' reply was this kind can come out only by prayer. That's what he said. But what prayer? What prayer made the difference? In this passage, had the disciples prayed? I don't think so. How about the scribes? No, they didn't pray. Well, it must have been the people. I don't see that they ever bent a knee. Then what prayer led Jesus to deliver the boy? Now, it may have been Jesus himself praying to the Father. Very well could have been. But in my mind, there's only one recorded prayer in the story. It's the simple prayer of a hurting man, if you can help us. If you can help us. And since God is more moved by your hurt and your heart than by your eloquence, he responded. The thing that makes this story in Mark so neat and clean is that God's response that day was yes. Yes, the boy will be delivered. We all know that his response could have been no. Because, see, I might imagine that a few dusty streets away from this encounter, there lived another man with a troubled son. Perhaps this boy was crippled. Perhaps this boy was blind, or perhaps he too was demon-possessed. And the father's heart was just as moved, and his prayer to God was just as fervent. And yet his son would carry his condition to the grave. God heard his prayer, and in his sovereign wisdom, he said no. Hardly a week goes by when I'm not asked the question, why does God choose to heal some and to not heal others? I'm sure the Apostle Paul asked the same question. You see, he was afflicted with a physical problem that he asked God to heal. Remember that? This same Paul that God had used to heal others pleaded with God 3 times to be healed himself. He writes about it in 2 Corinthians 12. He says, to keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And so therefore, Paul says, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Hang on, did I hear Paul right? Let me rewind that last verse. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, he says, in insults and hardships and persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Listen to me here. Perhaps God's greatest miracles are not found in healed bodies. Perhaps God's greatest miracles can be found in the faithful lives of those never healed. We need to think about that. Thirdly, this passage teaches us that we have a Father who knows our pain. The father in the story knew intimately the pain of his son, and he acted upon it because that's what fathers do. When we were in Kenya years and years ago, we set up a medical clinic in a church. Patty is a nurse, and so she was part of that clinic. And as we drove through the gates of the parking lot, we saw a man carrying his daughter to the clinic. She was probably 11 or 12, and she was very, very ill, very close to slipping into what we understood was a diabetic coma. And the image of that father has stayed with me all these years. He was living the pain of his child. Listen, if you are broken today, it is no surprise to God the Father. He is well acquainted with your hardships. In fact, in the person of Jesus, he has lived life here as well. I say this over and over and over again, but to me, the most precious thing about my God is that he came here to rescue me. He did not engineer salvation from a protected heavenly bunker. He journeyed here for me and for you. The author of Hebrews writes, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are. Yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." One more. Brokenness can be the beginning of health. Our culture does not encourage brokenness, especially in fathers. Brokenness is seen as weakness. Brokenness is the admission of our own inabilities. And for many of us, brokenness is exactly what we need for our lives to work right. Why? Because brokenness opens the door to submission to God. And submission to God is for our ultimate good. Some of us see that readily, and for others it doesn't come so easy. We try anything before submission. We do good things, we give our money to good causes, we go to church. But the writer of Psalm 51 got the picture. He writes, "God, you do not desire a sacrifice, or I would offer it. You do not want a burnt offering. The sacrifice you desire is a broken spirit. God, you will not reject a broken and repentant, contrite heart." The reality is simply this: if we want to really and truly have our lives count, we must give them away. I mean, isn't that crazy? It's crazy. If we want to have significant lives, then we need to quit trying to run them ourselves and give them away. Now, the good thing is that if your life is broken today, it's much easier to give away. When I sent our kids off to college, it was much easier to give them the hoopty car, the broken car, than to give them a brand new nice car. It's much easier for us to give the brokenness of our lives to God. It is simply a matter of saying, "God, I need a new life. Mine is a mess, and I can't go on living like this. I'm sorry for my contribution to this mess, and I invite you to come into my life and to make my life new." And out of the rubble of our broken lives will arise a new life formed and fashioned by the giver of life. So a couple days ago, I was thinking about the best way to end this sermon, kind of a smash finish. I decided maybe the best way to pull the whole thing together would be tell some dramatic story of some poor soul whose life had fallen apart, about how he admitted his brokenness and gave this lousy life to God. And I'd actually kind of narrowed my dramatic story count to 4 or 5 people when I stopped short. Now, don't get me wrong. God's dramatic work in people's lives is nothing to trivialize. If you have a story of radical change in your life, it is more than a smash finish to a sermon. It is a gift of grace. But it is my prayer today not to end with the story of someone else's miracle. Let's start a new miracle today. A new miracle in your life, out of your brokenness. How about that? Bow your heads with me, if you will. Is it time to throw up your hands and say, "I can't handle my life this way anymore"? Well, I encourage you to do that today. And while those hands are up in surrender, I encourage you to embrace the God who desires with all his heart to give you a new life and to give you hope. Father, I thank you that you are such a God who would love us so, that you would take our brokenness and you would turn it into hope, that you would turn it even into joy. But Father, it's a matter of us surrendering that brokenness to you. And so today I pray that you might give us courage to do that you might give us the strength to do that, so that you can do what you do best, and that is restoration. We thank you in the strong name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thanks for joining us today. We love to pray for you and celebrate alongside you. Please share anything going on in your life with us at hopechurchmemphis.com/prayer and subscribe to the Hope Church Memphis YouTube channel to experience previous worship services and more. Have a great week.